if God forbid it ever turns into a full-blown conflict, from a submarine warfare angle, that place could just turn into like a knife fight in a phone booth. Hi, I'm Ryan Faith, Defense and National Security Editor for Vice News, and I'll be answering your questions today on the line.
Hey Ryan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks.
So we have a pretty global crew with a bunch of interesting questions about issues around the world, fitting for our Defense and National Security Editor. So let's get it started with Adam Parakmady, who's calling us from New York, New York.
Well, hi Ryan, thanks for having me. Just to get right into it, I'd love to know how you see the future of U.S. military strategy, particularly in the Middle East. I think over the last few weeks we've seen U.S. support for the Saudi campaign in Yemen, pretty much 100% support. And does that really fit in with our own national interests going forward? And I'd love to know how Ash Carter, the new defense secretary, might influence that.
Well, that's actually a whole great set of questions, and actually a good thing with Ash Carter, because I think Shane spoke to Ash Carter and interviewed him, and that should be coming up pretty soon. Middle East military strategy for the U.S. is a little bit of a hash right now. There's sort of a default reflex position that we have that as soon as something happens, then we get very upset and we send John Kerry over there to go yell at everybody and make them try to go to the negotiating table. So our strategy in Yemen isn't wildly different from that. Now, the thing that's going to be really interesting is that that's not really what the Saudis are after. And so is this sort of reflex on the U.S. part and the difference between that and the Saudi approach going to be, does that reveal some sort of parting of the ways, or sort of, that there's no meeting of the minds between those two groups anymore? More broadly, I think the thing that's really got people rattled, and it seems to me be a bigger issue in the long term, is the activity in the north in Syria and Iraq, because, this whole Saudi-Iranian proxy war struggle throughout the Middle East is already kind of a horrible mess to begin with. And all of the ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, are something that made an already disastrous car wreck just a bit bloodier and messier. But yeah, I think the U.S. is probably going to be, for the most part, non-interventionist and just have a fairly steady pro-negotiation stance on Yemen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So thanks for coming on, Adam. Ryan, we got another question from Kosalan. So Kosalan's calling us from Toronto, and let's say hey.
Hey, Kosalan.
Hi there, Ryan. Hi. So my question, I have two separate questions. My first question is about private military contractors, or PMCs. Have we seen an increase in PMCs throughout the world, and have their roles expanded? And if they have, do you think this is a threat to global security or something that can help safety in the long run?
There has been an increase, and part of this goes back to the peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. And armies used to hire their own cooks, people in uniform to go do a lot of sort of maintenance tasks, and PMCs have that was sort of a big boost in the size of PMCs. So now contractors are providing a lot of behind-the-line services. And then there's certainly an expansion that we've seen in places like Iraq with Blackwater and other contracting firms. Going forward in the future, it's really still a little bit hard to tell where it's going to be going, because the changes in the last 10 years in that industry have been just spectacularly, pervasive and immense. At one remove, for instance, is hiring contractors to do private security as bodyguards. You can say, okay, now the U.S. is going to take care of President X, but the U.S. isn't putting guys in uniforms who are standing around wearing little U.S. flags as bodyguards. And so there's a little bit of a delamination there. The flip side is it also makes humanitarian intervention a lot easier. If you pair private contractors with local troops, so the private contractors are picking up communications, airlift, some of the very high-tech, high-maintenance stuff, and the local folks are providing the manpower, it reduces the political threshold for intervention. So you see a lot of different things are really sort of but pulling the field very, very sharply in different directions. I suspect this is going to continue because we regard contractor casualties much differently than we do national soldier casualties. And it's a lot easier to send money in somebody else's guns than it is to send your own soldiers. Now, whether that's going to be beneficial or reduce tensions, there's no real good answer on that one. But it is something definitely to keep an eye on. But thank you. Excellent.
My second question is kind of away from PMCs, and it's about the Arctic. Here in Canada, I've been hearing news about our soldiers doing exercise activities in the north. And with global warming, it's becoming easier to traverse through the north. And do you think that the Arctic is going to become sort of a hotspot for militaries to go there? And what countries do you think would be involved?
Well, the Arctic right now is an absolutely fascinating sort of thing from a geopolitical point of view, because I mean, for the last 60 years or so, it was sort of the flyover country for nuclear missiles. It was the place underneath which World War III would be fought to an extent. But the access to shipping routes and the ability to get large amounts of supplies in, basically from the sea, is going to be a big factor. But the mechanics of how this play out are going to be a little bit strange. I mean, you've got basically 8 countries who are sort of, who are somehow mixed up in all of this right now, and they seem to have a definite preference for hashing this out all out in conference rooms with terribly bad coffee and yammering about it endlessly. That said, as the Russians have restructured their military, have sort of effectively created a new Arctic command, had a huge drill. It's an article we wrote about, we covered recently, because it was a stupendously large amount of firepower given the actual proximate sort of threats they'd be facing. And the other thing you got to keep in mind is that most of the disputed territory is underwater. So how are you going to have that fight? And you've got a couple different things on that. One is that the Arctic Ocean is very shallow. It's comparatively. So this idea of terrain-involved submarine warfare might, 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road, find a really good home for that. But in addition to that, you've also got the fact of the ice packs, because even if they're broken up, they're not going away. And those make for a very messy acoustic environment and very hard for a lot of surface combatants to move through. So if God forbid it ever turns into a full-blown conflict, from a submarine warfare angle, that place could just turn into like a knife fight in a phone booth. It could just get really ugly quickly. So it's going to be interesting, but I think that a lot of the military preparations right now are to be seen as being able to respond rather than necessarily planning on going and fighting. You want to at least show that you have some capability. I mean, all of the stuff that that Canada's doing in the high Arctic is reflecting a capacity change rather than necessarily like putting 10 divisions of guys up at an Ellesmere Island to get very cold.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Koslan. So moving away from the Arctic, we got a question from Drew, who wants to know what your opinion about Ukraine is. Drew asked, do you see the current state of the conflict in Ukraine as an active war zone or something more like a modern-day Korea? Despite fire being exchanged on a daily basis and treaty violations taking part on both sides, is there any hope for progress, or do you see a re-escalation of hostilities as inevitable?
That's an excellent question. I think the thing that's sort of important about reading the negotiations and developments in Ukraine with regards to treaties and ceasefires and all this stuff is that there's an enormous difference between coming to the negotiating table and actually giving a good goddamn about what happens at the negotiating table. And I think from the broader Russian hybrid warfare approach is that they understand that all they need to do is show up and make vague, unverifiable promises, and that's sufficient to check off the box for them being contributive, or being helpful in making a positive contribution. And I don't really see a compelling reason why the price is too high for Russia to be, higher than they want to pay right now. And as long as one side in a fight believes that they want to continue that fight, there's just no real way around that. Looking a little bit further forward, if you look at the territory that Putin sort of carved out for Greater Novorossiya, as it goes all the way to Transnistria and Moldova, which is just, it's on the other side of Ukraine. I don't think that it will be possible for them to expand this fight that far west, but that sort of rhetorical space that he's buying himself means that there's always going to be some, poor downtrodden Russian somewhere that needs saving and needs saving with the help of a motor rifle unit or two. So yeah, I think that's going to be maybe something that's going to look a lot more like the Balkans in terms of just being very messy and very drawn out, and before it's going to come to any sort of nice, quick, crisp conclusion. But thank you, Drew.
Okay, yeah, so let's go back to our Skype callers. We have Mr. Henri Grossman, who's calling us from Washington, D.C. So let's say it, Henri.
Hey, Ryan. So I have two questions. First is, so France has a purchase order from Russia for two amphibious assault ships. And they have yet to fill this order since the Crimea War started. If Russia gets these highly capable Mistral assault ships, what kind of consequences can we possibly expect in the Caucasus and the Ukraine?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. The Mistral ship deal is actually one of the most fascinating stories out there because it's one that sort of keeps having a little bit deeper layers and you can keep peeling away. The two things to sort of keep in mind for the broader deal is one is the sort of role that it's playing for the French shipbuilding industry, which is in very dire straits. And I don't think that it would be easy for the president to sort of say, well, sorry guys, you're just out a couple $1 billion because they've been going through a lot of reconsolidation. The other part that's really worth noticing is that Russia, very much values or thinks of itself as a weapons exporter. So they don't really import complex systems often, and when they do, it's usually a big indicator. And the deal, particularly on the second ship, is that the French workers would be going to Russia to help them build the ship. So there's a technology transfer agreement. And since the end of the Soviet Union, the Russian ability to build large warships has really kind of declined drastically. So I think that the longer term perspective is that Russia wants to sort of rekindle this industry and just needs the human capital to do it. In terms of the immediate practical consequences of the amphibious assault ships is, of course, the Black Sea that's a spectacular place to do this kind of thing and hold. Even if you don't ever do anything, ever conduct a landing, is that you can hold a lot of things at threat. And particularly if you start getting out to the Med, then again, that sort of opens up there. The other one's going out to Vladivostok. And the Pacific is a really big growth area for amphibious right now, but I'm not necessarily certain what they'd be planning to do with it. I think that they just want to have the capability more than anything else, but it's, in the longer term, from a Russian perspective, is that Russia doesn't really need amphibious to do expeditionary warfare. And there's sort of a question of where they'd be projecting power to, how they intend to maintain it. So I think this is maybe even right now for them a learning experience more than it is a dagger that they want to have and go poke somebody in the eye with directly.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you.
And so my second question is so Mitt Romney in the 2012 presidential election cited Russia as one of America's top threats. And, he was sort of scoffed at for saying this because at the time other stuff was going on. And Russians recently, have used the rhetoric that NATO is their biggest threat. And of course, the problem is, with defense preparedness, is that many NATO countries haven't fulfilled the expectation that they spend a certain amount of their GDP on defense. Do you think that NATO is unprepared, and then will the United States fulfill its promise of mutual protection in the case of?
That's actually sort of the big question for NATO. I mean, is the future of NATO a political organization, or is it to be a military alliance? And there's a lot of God forbid that there is ever a major war, but I think it would it would sell very poorly in the U.S. if it was basically U.S. troops and U.S. equipment going over for people who couldn't be bothered to even spend a minimal amount of money. But hopefully that we won't be getting to that point. In terms of Russia being sort of the great big threat, I can't speak to Romney's thinking on it directly, but it is worthwhile noting that, in this scoffing, there's people saying, oh, of course it's China, or of course, the Middle East is a bigger threat, or so on and so forth. And I think that you've now got maybe 3 or 4 major concerns, and they're just very different flavors. So like one's a vanilla flavored threat, and the other is a chocolate threat, and the other is a strawberry threat. And so would be foolish to assume that Russia isn't going to be a threat, but I don't know if it's necessarily the biggest one. I mean, if nothing else, they're really one of the only 2 people who can really wage effective, large-scale, high-intensity, full-spectrum operations, and that should be on the U.S. radar. But yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Henri. So Ryan, let's turn it over to Twitter for a second.
All right.
Alfie Shaw sent us a bunch of really good questions, but I picked this one out. In light of the Israel-Gaza conflict in 2014 and everything that happened there, how far do you think wars can be won and lost on the social media front? What's your opinion about that?
That's a spectacularly good question. I mean, this sort of opens up, 5 or 6 different hornet's nests. But Israel, Gaza, social media, it's a little bit tricky because right now, and what we're seeing a lot in Ukraine, and we've seen arguably with the color revolutions, and we've seen arguably with the Israel-Palestine conflict, is the way that information is being used effectively in conflicts. And I mean, you had information playing a role, let's say in World War II, with breaking codes or a little bit of propaganda, or sending balloons with messages into North Korea. I mean, not World War II, but that's happened more recently. But what we've sort of seen is that the ability for information to flood very quickly and narratives to get established very quickly is the public reaction is getting more dialed up. I think the political process is becoming a lot more sensitive to it. Arguably, social media killed the Israeli incursion into Lebanon in the mid-2000s. And I think what we're seeing right now in Ukraine is going to be a really good taste of what's to come. As nations get a lot more effective and aggressive about leveraging information operations. I don't know if you can win a war with social media, but it's not crazy talk to discuss whether or not you could lose a war with social media. And I think we're going to be a long time driving out this is one of those things that's mutating fast enough towards clearly in motion, but it's not at a final state. So this is sort of something I'm keeping very much in mind to watch going forward, because it's tricky and ugly. But yep.
Okay, man. So we're getting near the end of the show, but we've got another Skype caller I'd like for you to say hey to. Let's say hey to Hannah, who's calling us also from Washington, D.C.
Hi, Ryan. So my questions actually have to do with the Asia Pacific. My first question is, who do you think is a bigger threat to peace and stability in the region, China or North Korea? And my second question, maritime security is a huge issue in the region right now. So I was wondering what your thoughts on how the U.S. should respond or deal with Chinese actions in the South China Sea.
It's a great set of questions. Last summer, we went to the Rim of the Pacific exercise to sort of look at how nations are engaging, and it was China's first trip to Rim of the Pacific as a participant, yet they also sent spy ships and to spy on the exercises they're joining. And we got a chance to talk to some Marines. I think we have a clip that we can run on this.
The Asia-Pacific region is incredibly important to the United States. It has been in the past, it is today, and will continue to be so in the future. Our country has established the rebalance policy to bring more forces, more effort, and more engagement with this very critical region. I think you will find that the Marine Corps has been challenged in order to have the right force at the right place at the right time. And things like RIMPAC 2014 gives us the opportunity to train together to ensure that our forces are ready for any crisis in the future.
So the fact that he's sort of emphasizing the ability to have flexibility, to respond flexibly to any crisis in the region, and some of the concerns that there's been about U.S. basing in the region, get to this idea of whether or not China or North Korea is a bigger threat. And it's kind of like, by way of very rough analogies, it's like which dog is a bigger threat. You might have a very angry, yappy dog that's very likely to bite you, but you might have like a giant, Rottweiler guard dog that it might not be as excitable, but the bite's a lot worse. And so, the question of which is a bigger threat is almost just sort of a big sort of semantic and philosophical exercise, because it's, threats over what time scale, what kinds of threats, are we talking economic, political, so on and so forth. Now, the maritime security in South China Sea thing, I think, is actually tips my judgment about China pretty significantly, because I think that what they're doing in a very effective way is a lot of the salami slicing tactics that you see in proliferation, and the ability to change the status of a reef from a reef to an island, from an uninhabited island to an inhabited island, and sort of rewrite the rules on the ground for subsequent territorial negotiations and change the facts, is in its own way as disruptive as Putin's incursions into Ukraine. It's, it's sort of a very big breach of, patterns and habits and international protocol. And I think that the fact that China is being very bold about their decisions and very bold about their path forward. Like, China, this is all now historically China. There's parts of China that are 1,000 miles away from China. Of course, they're parts of China. Is sort of an interesting leading indicator, and it's going to be a question now about whether or not their growing power, their rise, is a smooth one, or whether or not they're going to have some ugly growing pains and adolescent stumbles. So yeah, I think. But North Korea is so damn unpredictable, It's nobody's going to ever get a notice or a memo that says there's going to be a war in 2 weeks. It's one of those things we're just going to walk into by surprise. So it's really hard to say one way or the other. But
yeah, well, thank you for your thoughts.
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking.
All right, Ryan. So, hey, one more question before we call it a day. We got a tweet here, and one of our viewers is wondering, will future wars be fought by humans, drones, robots, or all of the above?
All of the above, definitely. I think that there's going to be there's already even a lot of focus on man-machine interfaces and drone, pairing units with drones. And how that's going to evolve is going to be a little bit of a hard thing to figure, because drones don't necessarily save manpower. They shift where the manpower is placed. So, for instance, a drone operation requires a lot bigger staff in some ways than a pilot does operationally. And the big thing that defense budgets being under pressure means is that they want to be able to reduce headcount. So maybe drones might not be the way to do it, but other kinds of automation might be the way to do it, like on some of the new Navy ships. But at the end of the day, is that it's sort of humans are their tools. What's more important, and they can't really be teased apart. They're not sort of really separable items. But now we're getting capabilities that are enough to really cause us to reevaluate that equation yet again. So it's going to be a lot of figuring out. But I think, yeah, it's going to be a blend. We just don't know what that blend's going to be.
Cool.
All
so,
right.
Ryan, you made it all the way to the end of the show. Why don't you say goodbye to all the viewers at home?
Well, this has been Ryan Faith, a Defense and National Security Editor with Vice News at On the Line, and answering your questions, and have a good day.
As the Marines tackle the question of amphibious landing, the evolution of new equipment and tactics is crucial. The success of amphibious operations will not only be a measure of U.S. power in the Pacific, but the Marines' ability to remain a relevant fighting force in the future of modern warfare.